Okay, welcome everyone. Good to see everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 6th class in the series, The Origins of Academic Jewish Studies by Dr. Chanan Gafni. And now without delay, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Gafni.
Okay, good evening or good noon. What I'm gonna do today, we're continuing, we're at session number 6 today, almost getting done. And we need to conclude the series with dealing with the last ingredient that I haven't discussed so far. So just 1 second, I'll share my screen with you. So let's just review where we're holding. We're in the second part of this mini series. The first part was a theoretical part. We spoke about the historical context, the ideology, the institutions, publications of Wissenschaft des Judentums, of modern Jewish studies. And the second part, the main part of this mini series, was devoted to actually exploring the type of scholarship that was done and trying to distinguish between critical elements in this type of scholarship and also the ideological components that were involved at the same time. So what we've done so far, we were trying to address or deal with 4 dimensions of modern Jewish studies, of critical studying. The first one was taking into account the time factor, understanding that our tradition is perhaps not as traditional people think, as something static, but rather something dynamic. There are changes that take place, it develops, it's constantly changing. So that's one thing, the time aspect. And in this class, in the class that we've devoted to that, we spoke about the idea of oral law as a reflection of the flexibility of the Jewish tradition. Then we spoke about the second dimension of modern Jewish studies, the variety, understanding that there's no one Jewish tradition. There are many forms and shapes of this same tradition. In every generation or every stage of its development, we are familiar with the leading voice or the prevailing voice, prevailing sound, but there are other sounds that exist as well. So when we spoke about the biblical times, there's also the Apocrypha or pseudepigrapha. There's Jewish Hellenistic literature, and even within rabbinic literature, there's more than one text, or not just certain Tanaim and certain Amoraim, but actually a variety of people and a variety of texts. In the previous session, we spoke about the context. We were trying to see or explore the context of our Jewish tradition, and we saw that unlike what traditional people tend to think, that the Jewish tradition is isolated, doesn't have any context, scholars were eager to show exactly the opposite. The Bible has its context, its Near Eastern context. The Tanaim have their Hellenistic context, and the Talmud has its Persian context. And there's an ongoing dialogue, change of ideas between Jews and non-Jews. The Jews are not operating in a sterile environment, but they're in contact with the surrounding cultures. So that was the third dimension. And in the last 2 dimensions, we'll raise one more issue, which is being more skeptical. Let me explain what I mean by this dimension. I think that traditional people tend to think that the rabbis are not humans. They're saints, they're angels, they're just perfect. You know that people tend to think that. So I'm sure you're familiar with this type of approach. And one of the things that a modern Jewish studies brings forth is the idea that we're talking with human beings, and people can make mistakes, they have their agendas, they have their unique approaches or unique ideas, and they're not angels, they're just ordinary people, and this is part of our tradition. So what we will do today is see how that element also is part of the modern Jewish studies. As a matter of fact, we'll devote 2 sessions for this theme, because we're going to explore 2 stages or 2 periods in the history of the Jewish tradition. We're going to speak first about the transition from the Bible to rabbinic literature, to the Tanaitic literature, and we'll discuss the issue of Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Bibles, or the plain sense of the Torah itself. And next week, we'll talk about a later stage in the development of Jewish law. We'll talk about the transition from the Tanaim to the Amoraim, or from the Mishnah to the Talmud. That will be for next week. But today we'll speak about Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Torah's plain sense, and the way that it was read by the rabbis. So this is the goal for today. And we'll try to get the idea, or at least feel, that modern Jewish scholars are making the rabbis look more human and less angels type. So that's going to be our main goal for today. This is the structure of today's class. So we'll start with talking about traditional versus critical interpretations of the Bible in general. That's going to be the first part. We'll talk about the idea of Derash. What is Derash? We'll talk about the two methods of Derash, or about the schools of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl. And we'll talk about the compositions. We'll talk about Midrashei Halacha, the books themselves. These 4 parts are not going to get still to modern Jewish studies. It's going to serve as some sort of background to what we're going to do in the second part of today's lecture, which will be devoted to the great mystery, one of the great mysteries that modern Jewish scholars were dealing with. We'll talk about some of their new insights or discoveries, and we'll also try to explore the ideological component that was also very much visible, even in this realm, like in other realms that we saw in previous sessions. So that's the goal. So you ready? We're starting. So we'll start with very general questions, and we're not going to give full answers to all of these questions, but this is a topic that we can devote an entire course or entire year. You can ask Charlene, maybe she can testify to that, that this is a topic that we can discuss at further length, but I still want to at least bring up some of these ideas or talk about some of these ideas. So I want to ask you a little bit to help me out, distinguish between what is the difference between traditional versus a critical way of interpreting the Bible. Maybe we can even start with interpreting any given text. And I want to start first with the critical approach. And I'm starting with the goal aspect. What do you think is considered an accurate interpretation, or the right interpretation of a given text from the critical perspective? And also with regards to the Bible, what is considered an accurate way of reading a text? What would be considered the right meaning, or the original meaning of that text? What do you think is the right way to interpret a text from a critical perspective? What's the goal of a critical scholar when he's reading a text? What is he trying to get to? What's considered the right interpretation of a text? Yes, Judy.
Well, you just went through a whole list, which I would think is the answer, namely time and context, and the influence of context, other cultures, trying to understand the language in its own time, as opposed to assuming it has the same meaning.
Excellent. Anybody else? I want somebody else to say another definition, and then I'll include everything you said in a second. You'll hear what you said in 1 second again. Who wants to add? What's the goal of a critical interpreter? What is he trying to get to? Anybody wants to add?
What it meant to the original audience?
Right. I think that not just to the audience, I would go even one step further. Yeah, Charlene.
And what the narrator wanted to say when it was written, right?
Maybe what the author had in mind. The goal from a critical perspective, when I read a text, I want to understand what did the writer have in mind? What was he trying to tell us in his composition? In terms of, if I'm looking at a text, obviously if I'm reading a 21st century text, it's easier for me because I'm familiar with his environment, with his vocabulary, with the reality in which he's operating. But when we're dealing with an ancient text where there's obviously a big gap, because I'm in the 21st century, but this text was composed 3,000 years ago or more, or even more. So I have a big challenge. This is a big obstacle. And as Judy was trying to tell us, the goals or the means that I would need, the tools in order to get to that point, would probably be trying to forget about the 21st century for a few minutes and move back in time to the period, study the language, get a sense of its historical environment, of its surrounding cultures. And if I can get to the mindset of that author back then, I can probably understand what he meant better. So what Judy was saying, the context is super crucial because I'm trying to get to the mindset of the author. So this is the goal, and these are the means of a critical interpretation of any given text. and presumably also the Bible. How are traditional people reading the Bible differently? Or how are traditional people viewing texts in contrast to critical people? And I'll strengthen my question. Don't they also want to understand the original meaning of that text? Everybody wants to know what the author had in mind. Everybody wants to understand the original meaning of the text. So in what way is the critical and the traditional way, in what way are they different? What distinguishes? Yes, David.
The nature of the author, human or divine. So,
okay, so how does that influence?
It is fair to say, has a relatively clear idea of what he's trying to say to humans, though even there's a potential difference between straight text and elusive or text that makes use of similes and other types of structures. A divine author is capable of having multiple meanings in the text, some of which are intended only for the greatest thinkers to pull out.
Okay, so I want to take one element of what you were saying and emphasize the fact that you're saying we're dealing with a divine author. But I want to attack or use this idea of divine author in a different way as well, in addition to what you're saying, not instead, but also in addition. I think that the fact that we view, when we read a divine text, and this is what is in the back of our heads, we don't really try to understand it only in the past. We're not trying to contextualize this text only. Why? Because when we read a divine text, what do we think about it?
We're trying to learn an ethical lesson, ethical, moral lesson from it.
Right.
That's usually what people
but even broader than that, you're right, but broader than that, I would say. If we read a text that comes from God, yes.
Then it's eternally relevant.
Right. We assume, at least most traditional people will assume, this is a timeless text. God didn't speak to certain people or to a certain generation at a certain time in history. This is supposed to be, at least for most traditional people, a timeless text, an eternal text that is always true. Now, true could be right in every realm. From a theological perspective, it can't provide us primitive information about what God is, because this text was composed by God. In terms of its theology, in terms of its ethics, we can't assume this text is not ethical in the 21st century, but and just to leave it in the past, because this is what God said, and if this is what God says, it has to remain ethical. It has to be true from a philosophical perspective, from a scientific perspective. Everything that the Bible seems to be saying is supposed to be always accurate, always updated. I can almost say that, speaking ironically, the more we will know about the world and the more we know about ethics and about theology, it would seem that we should understand the Bible even better, because this is what God said. So the more we know about the truth, that would help us capture better what the essence of this text is, at least theoretically speaking. In terms of means, I would say that whatever you know about the world, whatever you know about God, whatever you know about theology, signs, anything that you will learn is supposed to make you understand this text even better, because the more we know about it, we can probably get to the essence of this text, because this is God's words, and God's words are timeless. It's not just meant for one generation. It's not limited to a certain period in history, presumably at least. So here, I put it in this chart. I'll give you the answers, or at least how I phrased it, but obviously you can formulate it slightly different. So traditional people tend to think, even if they don't always say this is divine, and therefore they look for the original meaning, but they still assume that this is accurate, relevant, applicable, and so on. And from their perspective, everything you know should help you understand this text better. Philosophy, theology, ethics, the more you know about the world, the more you know about the truth, it should become more clear what this text is saying. So as we move in time, we should get a better understanding of this text, in contrast to critical people who would probably say the challenge grows bigger as we move, because we're getting more and more far and distant from the context, the historical context in which this text was composed. So from their perspective, it's just a human composition. We want to look for the original meaning, and history, languages, and cultures maybe would help us understand it, but we don't have to assume that it's still true and relevant. I think this on its own is a very important realization when we study the Bible, and often we speak traditional and critical people, and it's something that I think we should keep in mind all the time, right? That I'll just give you an example. Is the Bible ethical from a 21st century perspective? What do you think? Is this an ethical book? Do you imagine that if they were trying to, if somebody wrote this book in the 21st century and it was suggesting to teachers in 21st century schools, would you think it would pass any educational committee or of that sort? What do you think?
No.
No way, no way.
No way.
I don't know even where to start, right? Gender issues, who knows what, all sorts of issues you can come up with. For critical people, it's not a big deal. That's what people used to think back then, and it's fine. Maybe it's even impressive that this is what people had in mind back then. But from a traditional perspective, it's a bigger challenge because we assume this is what God said, and God didn't speak only for then. It's supposed to be ethical. And what we often do by when we approach such texts, we try to use interpretations and even creative interpretations to overcome such problems. And by doing that, very often we come up with interpretations that are not really just looking for the original meaning of the text in a literal sense, but we kind of impose our own ideas on these texts. So this is just a brief introduction. I think it's important to think about these things, and we can talk about it a lot another time. What about so now we're moving on to the second part, and this is a little bit about talking about the idea of Derash. So as you all know, rabbinic literature is not the only form of interpretation that existed in antiquity. There are all sorts of ancient Jewish interpretations that are found in many, many type of Jewish texts. I'll give you just a list that you can see. We have interbiblical interpretations, in other words, interpretations that are already found in the Bible itself. I'm sure you took courses or you learned about such things before. You can think of Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha as a type of ancient interpretations to the hardcore part of the Bible, to the 24 books of the Masoretic text. We have Dead Sea Scrolls. We have Jewish Hellenistic literature, Philo, Josephus. They all interpret the Bible in addition to other stuff they're doing. Ancient translations, poetry, archaeology. So look how many sources of interpretations we can find in antiquity. But also, obviously, we have, along with these, rabbinic literature. And they share one common denominator. They all agree on one thing. What's common, or what do they all share?
The divinity of the initial text.
Right, they all believe it's divine, and therefore they all read the Bible traditionally.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
The question is, when you are taught that what was given at Mount Sinai was the written text and the oral text.
Yeah, that's the difference.
What is the nature of this oral? Where does that oral text end in terms of the 21st century, even if you're a traditional person?
So this we have to devote a separate session for. It's the $1 million question, but it's not for today, unfortunately. We're not going to solve that one today.
This to me is struck me as a sort of a root of how you look at that.
Of course,
is how you look at what text you're learning.
Of course. I agree with you 100%. We're not going to explore that today, unfortunately. Okay, so there are all sorts of interpretations. We're going to be investigating today rabbinic literature. And I want you to tell me a little bit, how do you see, what is the idea? I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with the Derash or the Midrash of Chazal. What is exactly the word Derash? What are the rabbis doing when they're reading the Bible following their Derash system? I'm not interested now in the etymology of the word. What is the word Derash? Does it mean to seek, to investigate? Let's not get there. But I want you to tell me, what do you think the rabbis are doing when they're being Doresh? They're doing their Midrash when they're reading the Bible. In what way is it the traditional way of reading the Bible? What is Derash? How do you understand the concept of Derash? What are the rabbis doing here? And you try to characterize what exactly the rabbis were concerned with. What was their main issue when they read the Bible? When they read the Torah?
Filling in the blanks.
filling in the blanks. Okay,
You know,
but that's something that any commentator does. But
Yeah.
I think that there's something unique to what
but
the
then you
rabbis are
get
doing.
different stories that are not within the written text. Even,
Okay,
you
so
know,
that is
the typical of
certain.
Abraham and his father's idols, which does
Okay,
not
that's a good
exist in the
example.
text.
But
Yeah.
I think that the rabbis are doing something much more general than filling in holes in the text.
But they're using that stuff, they're using those fill-ins and what they talk about with the fill-ins and things in order to make it relevant for the people's
Oh,
problems.
good. So now you're already okay. So now you're talking about something which is crucial, which is the
Bringing in
relevancy of the text.
perhaps new moral contexts or filling
Okay.
out the moral context or whatever.
Okay. Anybody else wants to add?
Well, Derash involves extraction from something. But the question is it extracting to teach something new or extracting to support something that exists?
Okay, so Derash is certainly extracting something from the text. I agree with you 100%. And at least one way of defining, I think, what the rabbis are doing is they're also reading the Bible traditionally. But they're also concerned, but their main concern was to make this text applicable and relevant for the people of their time. At least this is one way of looking at what they're doing. And this is true both when we deal with halacha, with law, and with agada. When it deals with halacha, with law, they need to know how do we actually fulfill all the laws that appear in the Torah. How do we actually carry them out? When it comes to Agadah, maybe they're trying to make it more inspiring, relevant. When we read the weekly parsha of Yaakov and Esav, we want to think how it's talking, how it's relevant to the elections in the United States now. It has to be relevant. It has to be meaningful. We're not reading as history. We want to think how this will be inspiring for us. So I think at least one way of looking at Derash is we're trying to extract stuff from the text in ways that will help us understand how we carry it out and how do we also maintain its relevance for us. Let's give an example. What about lighting? The Torah says, "Lo teva'aru esh bechol moshvotechem b'yom haShabbat." Right? You should not light fire on the seventh day on Shabbat. Question: am I allowed to turn on my electricity on Shabbat? Turn on the lights using electricity on Shabbat?
No.
So let me ask first a critical interpreter. What would a critical interpreter tell me if I asked him, am I allowed to turn on my electricity on Shabbat? I'm knocking on some professor in the Bible department in some fancy university. I'm asking him, what do you think the Bible thinks about electricity? What would he tell me?
It doesn't.
He would tell me this is the most, what, Judy?
Well, obviously, there was no electricity, so
Right.
we're stretching it to apply to today.
Right. He would tell me this is the most ridiculous question I heard in years, and don't bother me. I'm writing my papers now. It's a stupid question to make. Obviously they didn't have electricity back then, and forget about this. What are we trying to play this stupid game to get into the mindset of people back then? What did they think about electricity? It's just an idiotic idea, and that's it. But for traditional people, this is not an option. I need to know, am I allowed to turn on my electricity or not? I need to get an answer. It's a practical question. Am I going to sit in the dark or am I allowed to turn on the light? The rabbis, when I'm speaking about it from a legal perspective, they're trying to solve such questions. They need to derive somehow from the text, is it allowed or not allowed? This is just one example, and I think this is a good demonstration that the rabbis are reading it traditionally, but their main concern is not theological concern or an ethical concern, maybe at least not the main concern. I think it was more about applying the laws and also maintaining the text as a relevant, as an inspiring composition. The question is as to whether the rabbis were even making the distinction between the critical or the literal meaning of the text in contrast to what they're doing is not even so simple or clear cut. I put here on the slide one source in the Talmud where the rabbis themselves talk about pshuto shel mikra, the pshat, the plain sense of the text. But this is the only text, I think, in the Talmud where this expression appears, pshuto shel mikra. And it's really something very rare. And it's not so clear to what extent are the rabbis aware of the fact that they're not reading the text historically, but rather they're trying to read some of their own ideas into the text. I'm not going to come up with a clear decision. Obviously, it's a matter of opinion. But I think that to a large extent, the rabbis were really trapped in this idea that the Bible is speaking to us, not to some people back in the past. And also they felt the Bible is supposed to provide us with answers to all the practical solutions. If the Bible said not to light fire on Shabbat, it also has to have some clue or give us some hint what would be the answer for electricity as well. It's supposed to be found somewhere there. It's not an irrelevant question for the Bible. We're still in the introduction. And now I want to talk to you briefly about two schools of Midrash that were very, the prevailing schools in the Tannaitic period, the school of Rabbi Ishmacl and the school of Rabbi Akiva. So let's read one passage from Rabbi Ishmacl and one passage from Rabbi Akiva. So who wants to read the Rabbi Ishmacl? We really need to rush because I really want to show you a lot of stuff still. Okay, so let's start with Rabbi Ishmacl. Who wants to read? If you can read it, it's a little bit blurry.
Aloud.
Who wants to read? Rabbi Ishmacl states, Rabbi Ishmacl.
The Torah may be interpreted in accordance with the following 13 principles.
In Hebrew, Yud Gimel Midot.
Right. An inference may be drawn from the similarity of words or phrases in two separate passages. 3, a general principle may be derived from a single passage or from two related passages. Number 12, the meaning of obscure words and ambiguous phrases may be deduced from the context or from subsequent passages.
Okay, so I just gave you 3 examples, and I want you to try to give me a sense, what type of interpretation was Rabbi Ishmacl following? Or what was he preaching for? What's his mindset? Just using these 3 examples. What?
Like the Bible interprets itself.
The Bible interprets itself, okay. But what do you think about the methods? You're right, the Bible helps us understand itself. What about the method? What type of method is it?
Very, very specifically text-based.
Text-based, so that resembles what Charlene was saying. The Bible gives us the answers itself. But I would say one more thing.
Analytic.
Very analytic, right? Very logical.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, this is the way we really read text. Even critical people read text in such a manner. For example, if I'm reading and I have an ambiguous word or obscure words, something is unclear. So I'm learning from the context what it means. Or using the second example, the number 2, Gzera Shava, what is called in Hebrew. Inference may be drawn from the similarity of words or phrases in 2 separate passages. This is how we learn how to speak. Let me give you an example. I'm holding this. If I tell my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, give me my phone. She doesn't know what a phone is, right? But if I'm going to hold the phone as I'm talking to her 10 times, and I'm going to say phone, 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 what's in her head, there's an association between the word phone and this object, right? And then when I'm going to tell her, bring me the phone, she already knows what I'm talking about because this link was in her head. This is Gzera Shava. It's the same thing. I don't know what the word a means, but within a context, it's clear that a means an apple. So then when I say the word a, people know it means an apple. So in a sense, it's a very rational way of understanding text. So this is Rabbi Ishmacl. He's much more rational or logical in his orientation. Rabbi Akiva was very, very different. Let's read just one famous passage. We're not going to read the entire legend because we just don't have time, even though it's fascinating. So who wants to read? Rav Judah said in the name of Rab. It's just a story, but it tells a lot about Rabbi Akiva. So who wants to read it?
When Moshe ascended on high, he found the Holy One, blessed be he, engaged in affixing tagim, coronets to the letters, the little extra bits that you find in a Ketav Sofer and a Sefer Torah. Said Moshe, look, Ribono Shel Olam, who stays your hand? What is, why are you doing this kind of thing rather than writing out things more generally? He answered, there will arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva ben Yosef by name, who will expound on each tittle heaps and heaps of laws.
Right. Okay, we could have stopped here, We could have stopped here. I'll let you continue in a second, but I think the point already here becomes clear. Rabbi Akiva's approach is that everything in the text has a meaning, has some significance. There's no element in the text that is not necessary. And from every tiny element, even those tagim that you're mentioning in the Sefer Torah, we can learn something. The expression here, heaps and heaps of laws upon each tittle, that itself is a drasha on the word kvutzotav taltalim shechorot. Think about it later. It's a chida for next time. Yes. We'll just read a few more sentences just because we're stuck in the middle of the story.
Ribono shel olam, said Moshe, permit me to see him. He replied, turn around. Moshe went and sat down behind 8 rows of students and listened to the discourses upon the law. Not being able to follow their arguments, he was ill at ease. But when they came to a certain subject and the disciples said to the master Rabbi Akiva, how do you know this? The latter replied, it is a law given to Moshe at Sinai. He was comforted.
Okay, we can stop here. You can already see this is a fascinating Agadah, and there's so much to talk about it. But for our concern, I think what is clear is that Rabbi Akiva is very different in his approach to Midrash. He's also trying to extract things from the text, but in a very different way. What's the root of this argument or of these two approaches that distinguish between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl? So there's a lot of literature about this. I just want to bring you 1 or 2 passages from the Talmud elsewhere where the Talmud might give us a clue where is this all rooted in. And this is in 2 places. I'm bringing just 2 places where the Talmud says, both in the Palestinian Talmud in the first source or in the Babylonian Talmud in the second source, that according to Rabbi Ishmacl, HaTorah dibra kedarka, or somewhere in the Babylonian Talmud, dibra Torah kilshon bnei Adam. Torah employs human phraseology. What does that mean? So I think what's clear here that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl have very different approaches to the text. Essentially what? Okay, so I'll help you out. Rabbi Akiva, or let's start with Rabbi Ishmacl. Rabbi Ishmacl says, true, this text is divine, but it speaks to us as human beings, and it uses the same type of language that ordinary human beings use. I'm not supposed to learn and extract from every word that the Torah says something, because the Torah is speaking in our type of language. Let's assume I was listening to a conversation in English. Did you notice how many times people say the word like in a sentence? Am I supposed to attribute significance to every time somebody says like in his sentence in English? It's just the way we talk. We don't think about every time we say that.
Like
in Hebrew also, we're influenced. Israelis are influenced by that too. They say the word ke'ilu all the time. So it's not just Americans. And but this is Rabbi Ishmacl's approach. It's divine, but God speaks to us in our way of talking, following our ways of speaking. Whereas Rabbi Akiva is more mystical in his approach. He feels this text is divine. It's not an ordinary book you get in the library. This is something really very different. God wrote this book. Every element, every tiny aspect of this text must bear some significance. So this is a little bit about the differences between these 2 approaches. Sometimes Rabbi Ishmacl even mocks Rabbi Akiva for his approach. He feels this is not the right way to read the text. Again, we don't have so much time to elaborate on that, but this is one sugya, one text from tractate Sanhedrin in the Talmud, where Rabbi Akiva is trying to derive some law from an extra vav in one of the sentences, in one of the verses in the Tanakh, and Rabbi Ishmacl tells him, which also led to some harsh death penalty, and Rabbi Ishmacl tells Rabbi Akiva, "V'chi mipnei she'ata doresh bat uvat notzi zo lisrefa," meaning just because you're attributing or deriving something from this extra letter vav, are we going to burn this innocent girl, or at least sentence somebody for more than they need? So in some cases, Rabbi Ishmacl is even opposing the implications of Rabbi Akiva's method of learning, of deriving law. However, in many other cases, and very often, they will agree about the law. They have no arguments what the bottom line is, all they're arguing is, how do we get to that conclusion? Rabbi Akiva will use his mystical approach that there's always something that we can learn from every element in the text, whereas Rabbi Ishmacl will say it's all logical. I brought you one example. Unfortunately, we don't even have time to get into all of these examples. This is from the story of an ox that gores. If an ox gores, so in certain cases, you need to pay. You need to compensate the person who was hurt or the property that was damaged. And the Mishnah is troubled by the question. This is true with regards to an ox that gores. What happens if it's a camel or other animals? I'll add, what happens if it's your car that hits somebody else? If you hit with your car somebody else? What would critical scholars say about such a question? The Bible speaks about an ox. What about cars? What about other animals? What would critical scholars say? Judy, following your line of thinking, what would critical scholars say? The Bible spoke about an ox. What about other animals? What about other vehicles?
I assume that they would have to say it only speaks about an ox and you can't derive much more out of it.
I would even add further. They would probably say it probably gives us a sense that back then domestic animals were only oxes and they didn't know of camels, and of course they didn't think about cars. But from the rabbinic perspective, that's not an option because we have other animals, we have cars, we have trucks. We need to know. So both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl try to learn. What about other animals? So Rabbi Akiva learns it for, yes.
Wouldn't even critical biblical scholars want to, I mean, people could generalize. I mean, we are capable of generalization. So we might tell a story about an ox, but obviously we hope it will be generalized to other similar conditions.
Right, I agree with you. I was trying a little bit to exaggerate, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that scholars would approach this by asking, why did the Bible speak about oxes? What can we learn about the context in which text was composed? And for rabbis, it's also about how do we apply this? And the Bible didn't speak about other cases, but we need to know. We need to solve these questions. Okay, so here you can see that the two scholars are learning this in different ways. And again, we don't have time. If you can see the presentation afterwards. I'll send the presentation, and you can see that they're both interested in the same questions. And in this particular case, they have the same answer. It's true by every animal. However, they will learn it in different ways. Finally, the last part that I want to deal with, and this is a little bit about the texts. For many, many centuries, there were 4 textbooks or 4 midrashei halacha in which the drashot or the interpretations of the Tanaim are introduced. We have the midrashei halacha, of course. That's why I should have said, I wrote in the top, Midrash Halacha. Of course, there are also Midrashei Agadah, but they belong to a later period, to the Amoraim, a later stage in history. I'm focusing now on Midrashei Halacha. So Genesis, Bereshit, there is no Midrash Halacha because there are only few laws in that book. So there is no Midrash Halacha, no legal interpretation to that book. But there are Midrashei Halacha for the remaining books. The Midrash Halacha for the book of Exodus, for Shmot, is called Mechilta. For Sefer Vayikra, Leviticus, we call it Sifra or Torat Kohanim. And for both Numbers and Deuteronomy, Bamidbar and Dvarim, Midrash Halacha was known as Sifri. Okay, so this is the first part of today's talk. What we were doing so far is speaking a little bit about the ideas of Midrash. What is Midrash? How is Midrash a traditional way of reading a text? Both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl are traditional because the questions that bother them are traditional type of questions. They have different approaches. And we also spoke about the different texts that existed for many, many centuries, that were known for many centuries. Here you see earlier editions of the Mechilta that I mentioned, of the Sifra and of the Sifri. Now we're moving into the 19th century. This is the second part of today's talk. This is a gigantic topic, so I had to choose what am I going to talk about, and we're going to talk a little bit about new discoveries in terms of the literary perspective, but also some ideological elements that were also involved in this kind of studies. So the first thing that is that modern scholars were troubled by or wondering is which school does each one of these midrashim follow? It's amazing to think that for centuries, people read those texts, the Mechilta, the Sifra, or the Sifri, but nobody really asked the simple questions. Can we show any connections or any links between the methods of Midrash, of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl, in these two books, and the existing Midrashei Halacha, the existing compositions that were known? For centuries, I would even add, it's amazing when you think about it, Maimonides, or people of his medieval scholars who were dealing with Midrash Halacha in the medieval period, they're hardly distinguishing between two schools of Midrash. They're not really saying something very clear, that there are two types of ways of looking at the Bible, at the Torah, in learning Halacha from the Torah. There's one approach, which is Rabbi Ishmacl, and the other one is Rabbi Akiva. They were familiar with this text I read before, but you don't get the sense that they're actually getting to the essence of this big debate or dramatic controversy between these two sages. And they were also not trying to look into the simple questions. Do the midrashim that we have nowadays, are they linked, or they follow, correspond to any of these particular schools? Can we come up with anything about that? Does the Mechilta, Sifra, or Sifri, do they follow one of these approaches or not? Let's assume I gave you a homework assignment. By next week, I'm not going to ask you to do that. Try to tell me which midrash follows which approach. What would you do? How would you come to conclusion? How can you decipher? How can you answer such a question? What would you do? If I asked you, tell me, give me a sense, which of these midrashim follow which one of these, which school, which method? What would you do? I'm not asking you to do it, just theoretically speaking. Yes, David, I see you have.
You'd start by looking at the language of the midrashim, and you would tend to note that certain terms, that is, terms of logic, certain terms of questionings, would characterize one book or one corpus, and that would not be the same in the other corpus. And you might even find that those terms are consistent across certain corpora, plural of corpus, so that you could even start grouping them. You wouldn't necessarily, though, rely upon the distinction between Dibrat Torah B'Shumnei Adam, because it turns out that turns out not to be a particularly good differentiator between the followers of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmacl, as Jay Harris has shown in his book.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to use from what you're saying, terminology. Terminology is a crucial way, trying to distinguish using terminology. What else?
The individuals being quoted.
Right, the rabbis, the names of the sages. Are we going to see in one book sages that are linked or associated with Rabbi Akiva more frequently, or ones that are associated with Rabbi Ishmacl more frequently? Is there any correlation between these two questions? But the third element, which I think is also true, and that is the method. How do people derive halacha? Do we see that one book tends to be more logical in the way that they derive halacha, in contrast to the other one that is perhaps a little bit more mystical in its approach, meaning deriving halachot or laws from every tittle or every letter in the text, every nuance in the text? So here you can see this is what scholars indeed have done. They follow the name of sages in each one of these books, identified parallels in rabbinic texts that also are helpful to understand. Even if you have an anonymous text, if you see the same law appear elsewhere with somebody's name, so that could give you also a sense. Obviously, types of method that are employed more frequently in each midrash, and finally, unique terminology. So this is indeed what scholars have done. The main scholars that were involved in this were two scholars from the city of Vienna. One of them was called Isaac Hirsch-Weiss, and the other one was Meir Ish Shalom. And it's a fascinating story. They were working, I think there was just a wall separating between their two offices in the rabbinical seminary in Vienna. But nevertheless, they both put out editions of Midrashei Halacha in the same time, in the 1860s, each one claiming he's not aware of the fact that his next door neighbor is also doing the same thing. So in the 1860s, you have full editions of Mechilta and Sifra put out by Isaac Hirschweiss and by Meiri Shalom simultaneously. It just gives you a sense that scholars were always having issues, not even back then. It's not a new 21st century phenomena. So these are the first two, but also David Zvi Hoffman was very involved in this. And they came to a rather surprising conclusion, which was that some books are actually linked with Rabbi Ishmacl, and some of them are more closely related to Rabbi Akiva. Essentially, Shmot was closer to Rabbi Ishmacl, Bamidbar was closer to Rabbi Ishmacl, and the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy were closely related to Rabbi Akiva. And again, they were following the patterns that I was talking, especially, David, this is connecting to what you were saying, especially they were checking drashot that are rooted in verbs that are using, these double verbs such as kareti karet, sakoli sakel, bashen mevushal, all these words that you have that where the Torah employs a double verb in order to strengthen its expression. So these drashot only appear in the texts of Rabbi Akiva and hardly ever occur in the texts of Rabbi Ishmacl, which was one way that scholars were trying to distinguish between these two schools. So this is the conclusion they came up with. And then the next obvious question came about, which is what? So fine, we were able to link each text to each scholar, to each sage. And then the obvious question came up, and that is what?
Did the schools have views on the missing books? With a question.
Right, or I'll put it in a different formulation, but the same question you're saying. Can we explain why did each school interpret specific books? Why did Rabbi Ishmacl only interpret the book of Exodus and not Numbers? And why did Rabbi Akiva only write books on Leviticus and Deuteronomy? Is there any reason for this? All sorts of speculations were brought by scholars back then. Really awkward ideas, maybe. Some of them were even trying to suggest that maybe Rabbi Ishmacl was more interested in themes that are involving Exodus and Numbers, whereas Rabbi Akiva was more drawn to the laws of sacrifices or purity. They were relying on a text in the Talmud where somebody tells Rabbi Akiva, "Klach lechaitze negaim ve'ohalot." You're more into purity issues. So maybe he was more drawn to specific fields of halacha, whereas Rabbi Ishmacl was doing other stuff. And again, and many other speculations came up. But
you think of geography? Did they think of geography?
What about geography?
Were they in the same place?
They were more or less in the same place, and nevertheless, each one is learning different books.
At school, which the group to which they belonged, to which they associated mostly.
So these, what you're saying is the type of ideas that indeed scholars were trying to explore. However, the first big contribution
towards not the types of ideas, but the attitudes towards ideas, the particular ideas would separate the schools. The way
but we still need to explain why would certain schools be drawn to interpreting specific laws in the Torah? Is there any reason why the school of Rabbi Akiva would be more drawn to Leviticus and Deuteronomy? So the first important contribution.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, might we say that some of the books did not survive from some of the authors?
Good.
So
Excellent.
They did write it, but for some reason we don't have it.
Good. So that's exactly what we want.
Some had more stories and others had more laws. Deuteronomy.
We're talking about legal compositions. All of those are legal compositions. There are separate midrashim, which are midrashei agada, devoted to the non-legal stuff. But these are midrashei halacha. So the first thing, and this is why we're doing this mini series, is first to learn a little bit about discoveries in the 19th century. One of the most important discoveries in the 19th century was learning that there were indeed other midrashim that should be attributed to the alternative schools. Where did people find these midrashim? So part of it was new texts that became familiar to European scholars that they were not familiar with till then. Texts like ancient midrashim, old midrashim like Yalkut Shimoni, Midrash HaGadol. These are medieval midrashim, but they contained very earlier texts included in them. Earlier drashot were included in them. And what modern scholars were managing to do is find or trace the missing parts of midrash in these later, old midrashim. But the second thing is the discovery of the Cairo Gniza. In the Gniza in Cairo, you see here, this is just an illustration, it's not the real thing. But here you see the Gniza in Cairo that was discovered in the end of by the end of the 19th century. So here you see, this is where the Gniza was. People were starting to find fragments and fragments, and essentially they were able to reconstruct a lot of the missing midrashim. So now, by the beginning of the 20th century, people were able to talk about all the missing texts, or at least many of the missing texts that scholars gave all sorts of names. It's a little bit blurry here, so I don't know if you can see it, but the black parts are the more traditional text, and the lighter parts are the ones that were rediscovered, so it's hard for you to see. But scholars came up with two forms of the Mechilta. Mechilta that belongs to the school of Rabbi Ishmacl, but also competing Mechilta of Rabbi Akiva, which is called Mechilta Derash, Mechilta that comes from the school of Rashbi, which was a student of Rabbi Akiva. We have midrashim for Vayikra, for Leviticus, and for Dvarim, at least fragments of midrashim that belong to the school of Rabbi Ishmacl, and also for fragments that belong to the school of Rabbi Akiva. So one big contribution of 20th century, end of 19th and 20th century scholars is coming up with many, many missing texts. So now the question is only, why did we use particular versions of each school? Why did we make this compilation that follows, that, shifts from one school to the other? But not that these rabbis were only interested in specific books and not in other books. So this is one important contribution of the 19th century. But the last few minutes I want to devote to the ideological component, which I think was also a very interesting element in this story. Let me ask you questions. What do you think, to which school were 19th century scholars more drawn to? Which school did they favor? The school of Rabbi Akiva or the school of Rabbi Ishmacl? Which one would they prefer?
Rabbi Ishmacl.
So you're saying Rabbi Ishmacl. Why?
Because it's more logical and less
more
mystical.
Logical. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so what you're guessing makes a lot of sense, right? What you're suggesting is that you imagine that 19th century scholars would follow Rabbi Ishmacl because he sounds more rational to you, more logical to you, and you think that these scholars are supposed to favor people who read the text more literally, and that mystical types of reading the text, trying to attribute things to the text, is not going to be necessarily what they're going to be looking into. Yes, Elise?
Yes, actually, I was going to guess Rabbi Akiva, because when you have a more mystical overlay, you can interpret more than
Excellent.
if it were
Beautiful.
kind of written down and logical.
Okay, excellent. So let's see what actually happened. And this is quite fascinating. I fear to see the shift in this realm. Many scholars in the 19th century, at least in the earlier parts, and dominant scholars of Midrash, were indeed drawn to Rabbi Ishmacl. I brought you just a few examples. Sometimes they don't even say, they don't express it explicitly, but you can tell easily that this is who they like. Heinrich Gretz, did you hear of Heinrich Gretz? Very famous historian who lived in Germany.
History, yeah.
Right, he was active in Breslau, in what became later on the JTS school, in the rabbinical seminary in Breslau. So he was working with Zacharias Frankel, if you remember his name. And here in his historical composition, Divrei Yemei Israel, Geschichte der Juden, so he talks about the fact that, I'm reading it a little bit in Hebrew, but then I'll translate the English. He talks about the fact that
written in German.
Yeah, it was written in German, right? But this is the Hebrew translation and English. I figured that nobody would prefer reading it in German here, so I just quoted the.
Had an easier time with the German.
You would have an easier time with the German?
I studied the German when I was at an age where I could absorb some language. I studied
So
Hebrew late, and I've never been able to absorb it properly.
So we can test your German next week if you want. Okay, so he says as follows, Rabbi Ishmacl hu hapashtan hameyasher lechet bebi'urei המקראות על פי הבינה הישרה, ויודע לכוון את הכתובים להוכיח מהם הלכות, מבלי להוציאן ממשמעותם בדרכי לשונם הפשוטה. I guess very liberal translation. Rabbi Ishmacl is following the plain meaning according to common sense without departing from their literal original meaning. So this is one example why people would prefer Rabbi Ishmacl. Also, Isaac Hirschweiss that I mentioned a few minutes ago, he said, and he says it very explicitly, Im nasim eneinu, if we pay attention, bechol darchei Rabbi Ishmacl v'torotav, betchunot drusha betalmudot, we follow and trace the way he's studying halacha, nodeh, we must admit, ki haya lo yitaron al kol chachmei doro. He was better, he was superior to all sages of his generation. And he talks about the fact that he was objecting Rabbi Akiva's approach to derive new laws with these super creative ways of reading the text. So that was indeed the initial way that we would expect people to approach this. What's interesting is that liberal scholars, such as this guy, you know this guy. This is Abraham Geiger. People will refer as the founder of liberal Judaism, of the Reform movement, whatever. We don't want to get into all these distinctions. In his book, in Hebrew, it's called Hamikra v'Targumav, initially Urschrift und Übersetzungen der Bibel. So the Bible and its translations, and the title is even longer. In a surprising manner, he prefers Rabbi Akiva rather than Rabbi Ishmacl. And I would even add, in his earlier years, he was much more linked to Rabbi Ishmacl. But as he goes older, he suddenly makes a very interesting shift, and he prefers Rabbi Akiva rather than Rabbi Ishmacl. This is rather surprising, and I think that Felice was giving us a hint why. And here again, we see how closely linked were ideologies and scholarship. Abraham Geiger, I think, at a later stage understands we're not really interested in reading the Bible critically from an ideological perspective. If we want our tradition to be developing, flexible, open for changes, we need to allow some freedom, some liberty for the rabbis in the way they read the text. And for that precise reason, some scholars felt Rabbi Akiva is actually doing the right thing, not as a Bible professor. If you want to read the Bible critically, Rabbi Ishmacl is probably closer to that thing, although he's also traditional in his way, but he's reading it more closely to what the text is saying. But from a rabbinic perspective, from an ideological concerns, Rabbi Akiva will allow a lot more freedom. So the rabbis are not just, trying to transmit a tradition. When they're interpreting a text, they're trying to lead the halacha into the directions that they're interested in. And from that perspective, Rabbi Akiva is actually much more helpful and allows the halacha to go in the right direction. I'll just quote one text from Abraham Geiger, and we'll conclude with that. Rabbi Akiva ve'ulam, after he talks about Rabbi Ishmacl, he says, ve'ulam Rabbi Akiva nitzach. Rabbi Akiva won this battle. Ho'il v'chol da'at bnei doro hayta letzido, since all the rabbis of his time were following him. Uvemiktzat gam mishum shita mechukemet beve'ur hamikra. In addition to that, he had this clever idea of reading the text. Haya kovea al yada halachot chadashot umevatel halachot kodmot. Using this new creative way of reading the text, he has a lot more freedom to attribute whatever he thinks to the text. Cancel halachot or create new halachot. Ha'itnagdut lo ila klum. All the objections did nothing. Yado shel Rabbi Akiva hayta al ha'elyona. He won this battle. Hazman hachadash kibel et deotav. The new time accepted or welcomed his new approach. Hu nechshav lemechadesh haTorah. He was the person who revised or innovated the Torah. It's very interesting. We would think he's the mystical guy. There's no basis for what he's saying. But interestingly enough, he becomes the hero of 19th century liberal scholars because they want that. They don't want people, this strict reading of the text. There's something beyond understanding what the text meant. it's also where we want this text, where we want to lead our tradition, in what directions. And if this is what Rabbi Akiva was doing, obviously Abraham Geiger could do the same thing in the 19th century. Okay, we're done. I hope that Feliz, I'm very happy with your answer.
Can I make
Yes,
one
David.
observation? You use the term mystical with respect to Rabbi Akiva, and I think that's unfortunate. That his drisha of tagim, or of is only one element, and he gets tagged with the idea of mystical because of his association of Arba Shenichnasu L'Pardes. In fact,
also because of Yoshua Heschel, Abraham Yoshua Heschel, he came up with this.
But in fact, most of the Midrashei Halacha of both the school of Rabbi Ishmacl and of Rabbi Akiva focus upon something that's not even listed in the Yud Gimel Midot, which is Riboy Umiut, or Yitur, when they focus on extra words or extra letters. It's not in the Yud Gimel Midot, but the vast majority of the rationales of Midrashei Halacha rely upon both. And there are some slight differences between, described in Heschel and elsewhere, between schools of Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva, but they are largely consistent on this point. So I think that identifying Akiva as a mystic is marchik lechet.
It's marchik lechet from 21st century perspective, but at least in the 19th century, people did view them as drastically different. And from that perspective, it's very fruitful for us to think, to learn about their ideologies, because 19th century scholars, from our perspective, is not only important for understanding the Midrash, but also seeing how did people study Midrash back then. And from that perspective, I think it's a fascinating observation. Nowadays, things are obviously changing, and there's more updated research that probably would present things slightly different, or not even slightly different.
Quite different.
I agree with you. Yeah. Okay, next week we're going to give our final discussion on Mishnah's plain sense. Even more, I think it was even a more dramatic battle in the 19th century. And perhaps we'll even have a few minutes to do some brief review of what we've done in the last 7 sessions. So take your time. If you have 5 minutes even every day, just look into the old recordings of the previous sessions, and you can just get a sense, so we can do a brief review. So we're done, just enjoy the moment, but also we take something for our future studies as well. Okay, so have a nice week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for another wonderful class, Dr. Gafni. I'm looking forward to the final class next week. It sounds like we'll also do a little bit of a review of the previous classes that day, next Tuesday. Thank you also to everyone who joined us today on Facebook, on Zoom, on Derash Live. We are going to continue our full program this evening at 8 p.m. With the 6th part of a multi-part series on Imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud by Rabbi David Silber. In addition, we have many more classes going on right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or you can watch them live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again, Dr. Gafni, and everyone else who joined us today. And I'm looking forward to seeing you at one of our upcoming classes at Derash. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.